In this section of the talk, we'll discuss how safe is safe enough. Perception, as well as engineering calculations, significantly affect how safe might be safe enough. Ultimately, an engineering argument may look good on paper, but if the buying public does not trust the technology, then it will be difficult to see widespread adoption. In general, there is a reservoir of distrust of highly automated driving technology in the public. That distrust extends to Europe as well. Some of that distrust is centered on well-publicized adverse events. But another part of the trust issue is that the public, in general, finds it difficult to understand the technology in a way that promotes comfort and trust in it. A frequent talking point when considering the potential safety of autonomous vehicles is considering the performance of supervised SAE Level 2 systems such as Tesla's so-called Autopilot. The question is the car safer with or without the Autopilot activated? This graph shows some analysis which indicates that the vehicle is safer most of the time with Autopilot off compared to Autopilot on highways. The vertical axis of this graph is miles between crashes, and so in this case, up is good, and Autopilot off is better. While this data is not robust and authoritative enough to draw sweeping conclusions about particular vehicles, it does make important points to ponder. The first is that an automatic assumption that a computer will be better than a person might not be true. Given this data, there is no clear safety advantage to operating in Level 2 mode. Rather, it looks to be somewhat safer operating the vehicle with the human as a driver and using the active safety technology to back up the human operation. However, it's important not to read too much into this graph because the automation, the Autopilot on line, still has a human who's responsible for supervision, and many of the crashes are blamed on the human not properly supervising the automation. Because this system is not intended to work without human supervision, it's not appropriate to extrapolate this performance to what would happen on a fully automated vehicle. However, based on this data, the claims that fully automated vehicles will necessarily be safer than human drivers is not yet supported by real-world data. It's common to hear that people want an automated vehicle to be at least as safe as a human driver. But the question is, does it need to be safer, and if so, how much safer, before people will widely accept the technology? A significant concern is that cognitive biases may lead to unrealistic safety requirements. This study shows that most people require higher levels of safety before agreeing to ride with an automated vehicle than with a human driver. While this talk will not go deeply into psychology, some of the related issues have to do with giving up control of driving the vehicle and any concerns born of widespread media coverage of incidents involving the technology. The takeaway here is that a purely numeric engineering analysis that shows a small increase in safety compared to typical human drivers, whatever those might be, is unlikely to be enough to convince the public to adopt the technology. Rather, it is likely that significantly increased levels of safety will be required, and that increased level of safety will have to be clearly communicated and understood by the users of the systems. One strategy for attaining trust in a complex, life-critical technology is to involve the government in regulatory activities. In general, the United States government regulates automotive technology. The state governments regulate and license drivers, while the federal government is responsible for regulating the technology inside the vehicles. Historically, the automotive technology has been more electrical and mechanical than computer, although that has dramatically changed recently. With automated vehicle technology, the driver is arguably technology in the form of software and hardware inside the vehicle. That puts a question mark in terms of the state's role in certifying the driver when it's part of the vehicle, which traditionally the federal government has controlled. Complicating matters is the fact that the regulators have minimal software expertise. Cars are, for the most part, still being regulated as if software were perfect. In the United States, vehicle makers self-certify the safety of their vehicles. Regulators have the authority to check on those self-certifications and initiate recalls if there are safety defects. But the regulatory action is predominantly reactive in the form of recalls. The legal system is only able to get involved after a loss event has occurred. So in the United States, the basic situation is car makers can send vehicles out on the road as long as they say they followed the relevant safety standards, and the predominant regulatory and legal actions happen only after there's been a serious crash or an identifiable pattern of problems on the road. The European Union is starting to specifically regulate automated vehicles, for example, with the automatic lane keeping system regulations. Their strategy is type approval based on testing. That means that the vehicles have to be approved by an independent test agency before they're allowed out on the road. Regardless of the US or the EU regulatory regime, a significant issue in safety is that safety is measured primarily via vehicle tests. In the US, the FMVSS, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, apply, as well as NCAP testing for particular features. In Europe, there's EU type approval testing and Euro NCAP. A significant issue for safety of automated vehicles is that these existing testing regimes look at the vehicle functionality on a test track or the like. They emphasize whether the function works, not software safety. That means things such as, do the brakes stop the vehicle in a reasonable amount of time? Do the telltales light up for low tire pressure, and so on, are tested in a very specific way. That's a very reasonable approach to ensure that some basic level of vehicle operational competence is present. However, it does not begin to touch issues of software and software safety. For example, if the tire pressure light activates under a very specific set of conditions, then the feature is said to be acceptable. Questions not addressed during such testing are whether the tire light activates across the entire spectrum that it's intended to, or whether it sometimes activates but sometimes does not due to a race condition inside the software. In other words, if the vehicle can do a limited set of things once properly, then the vehicle is declared to have passed the tests. Looking carefully at these tests, the tests do not purport to establish safety all on their own. What they do is measure minimum competence, above which is merely a starting point to safety. This situation makes the automotive industry unique compared to other industries in that functional safety standards and software safety standards are not required to be followed when deploying equipment for use by the general public. Going by the numbers, one way of looking at how safe is safe enough is to look at the current rate of fatalities, injuries, and crashes, and assert that as a minimum, a highly automated vehicle should be at least this good. The 2019 National Highway Traffic Safety Administration NHTSA data on public roads shows that there were about 36,000 fatalities, which is 1.1 per 100 million miles, almost 3 million injuries, and almost 7 million police-reported crashes. It should be noted that not all crashes are police-reported. This data includes drunk drivers, speeders, no seatbelts, and so on. This means that unimpaired, law-abiding drivers would have lower crash rates than what is listed. A footnote on this data is this is only for public roads, so if private roads such as parking lots and driveways are included, the numbers do go up appreciably. Out of this data, non-occupant fatalities, such as pedestrians, are 20% of the total, which is a significant and growing fraction of the fatalities. Motorcycle fatalities are 14%. An implication of this data is that you should expect 0 deaths in a 10 million mile road testing campaign, or on average expect 1/10 of a death and 2/100ths of a pedestrian fatality. That means the budget for a road testing campaign needs to be no fatalities and not even any near hits of pedestrians. An important consideration when asking whether or not you have achieved positive risk balance, in other words, better than a human driver, is which driver are you better than? Well, a typical U.S. number is about 100 million miles between fatal mishaps for human-driven road vehicles. it's important to break down the statistics that contributed to that and ask which drivers do you expect to be better than, or which drivers do you want to remove from the data before you do a comparison. In the US, it's typical to see 28% of fatalities related to impairment. So in determining positive risk balance, do you want to include the drunk drivers and say you're as good as typical humans, including all the drunk driving crashes? Or do you want to be as good as a not drunk, not impaired driver? 26% of crashes are speed related, but it's important to note that this is not necessarily speed limit violations, but rather too fast for condition violations, which in some cases are slower than the speed limit. 9% is distracted driving, 2% is drowsy driving, and it should be noted that some crashes involve multiple factors, so the total adds up to more than 100%. When determining the basis for a positive risk balance, consider which of these categories you want to exclude from the crash data before you do the comparison. It might well be that you need to be at more like 200 million miles between fatal mishaps to compare yourself to a well-behaving, competent, skilled, unimpaired human driver. One of the arguments for vehicle automation being safer is that it has a faster reaction time than humans. Another thing to consider when comparing yourself to a human is the age and experience of the human. If you look at fatalities based on driver age, you'll see that below about 35 years old, the crash rates are quite elevated, especially for under 25-year-old drivers. Crash rates stabilize for middle age and then increase only slightly above 69 years old. A driver that's 70 years old is not so bad compared to people under 35 years old, which may come as something of a surprise. The younger drivers unquestionably have faster reaction time, and yet they have a higher fatality rate. This can be explained in part by bad behavioral choices such as driving drunk, but that's not exclusive to youngsters. Another interpretation is that experience and maturity of judgment can outweigh the differential in reaction time. Simply saying that faster reaction time guarantees safety is unlikely to be true. The real situation is that some combination of reaction time and maturity not to get into dangerous situations in the first place is more likely to be predictive of eventual safety. When considering whether a particular automated vehicle is safe enough in comparison to human driver experience, it's important to realize there is significant variation depending on location and other types of ODD factors. As a starting point, the U.S. national average for 2019 was 11 deaths per 100,000 people and 1.11 deaths per 100 million miles. However, setting that as a target for an automated vehicle is unfair either for or against the vehicle. The minimums versus the maximums have a dramatic difference. For deaths per 100,000 people, there's a 7.7 times difference. For deaths per 100 million miles, there's a 3.4 times difference. This means that a particular vehicle operating in a particular location could vary dramatically from the U.S. national average, and that would not necessarily mean it's either acceptably safe or not acceptably safe compared to a human driver. It's well known that some ODD geographic areas are complex and difficult to drive in, and some are easy. This information should be taken into account when setting a target for testing or limited-scale operations. Another factor that affects safe enough is the fatal crash type. Even if the number of fatalities overall would remain the same, if the proportion of pedestrians or other vulnerable road users varies dramatically, even with a lower total, that might still be considered an unacceptable safety outcome. As with overall fatalities, the crash types vary dramatically based on location. The District of Columbia has the highest pedestrian fatality rate at 39%, and New York, Florida, and Delaware have the highest bicycle fatality rate at 5%. Additionally, urban versus rural has a significant difference. Urban driving has a fatality rate about half that of rural driving. There are other factors based on day-night, weather, vehicle safety features, and so on. The takeaway from all this is that it's not good enough to simply say you are better than a typical driver on a nationwide basis without being much more specific about the types of fatalities, the types of injuries, the types of crashes you're experiencing compared to a fairly fine-grained representation of what those same apples-to-apples comparisons look like in the specific area you're operating in. In addition to significant variation across different geographic areas and other ODD factors, there's the issue to consider of the demographic characteristics of potential victims of automated vehicle crashes. The notion of a positive risk balance means that, on average, automated vehicles will have fewer losses than comparable human-driven vehicles. This is often simplified into talking about fatalities, but life-altering injuries and injuries in general should be considered, as well as potentially property damage. Even if, on average, losses are somewhat better than for human drivers, there are still going to be societal issues if the fatalities especially have a different victim profile than current human drivers. Consider what the reaction would be if the number of fatalities goes down overall, but the number of fatalities of people with a particular skin color or who wear a particular style of clothing or who live in certain neighborhoods increases compared to human drivers. What if the number of fatalities goes down overall, but fatality rates for people not seen as typical, in other words, not like the training data, go up? That might include children, that might include people with various impairments, it may include people who have trouble jumping out of the way of a moving vehicle, or whatever. Similarly, what if fatalities increase for certain types of road users, such as pedestrians, cyclists, or people who walk in the middle of the block? In other words, improving the average fatality and other loss rates may not be good enough, especially if a readily identifiable segment of the population suffers significantly increased loss rates in exchange for the overall decrease. Other possible considerations to thinking about how to measure and evaluate whether an automated vehicle is safe enough is to think about the expected cost of insurance, which might go up even if the fatality rate goes down, or the converse driving safety, versus trying to have a system that has as low as reasonably practicable loss rates. Consider that as low as reasonably practical might or might not be better than a human driver depending on the maturity of the technology. Also consider adverse newsworthy events. Even if the overall fatality rate is lower across all the boards and all the bins that matter, if there are too many high-profile adverse news events, it may erode public confidence in the technology, even if overall the technology would otherwise be acceptably safe. One path to establishing trust in automated vehicle technology is to follow a standards-based engineering approach. This involves a number of standards that form a stack of different scope and levels of detail. At the vehicle safety level, FMVSS and NCAP, Euro NCAP, ensure the safety of basic vehicle functions. In other words, you know that the brakes will work, you know that the steering will work, and so on. Above that, there's a need for cybersecurity standards such as SAE J3061 and SAE 21434. Additionally, there's a need for functional safety standards such as ISO 26262 to cover equipment faults. Some aspects of automated vehicles go beyond the scope of 26262. That does not mean 26262 is inapplicable. It is very much applicable, but it doesn't cover everything, so additional standards are needed. Another level of standards beyond functional safety cover the dynamic driving function, sensing, sensor fusion, and so on. Those standards are covered by ISO 21448, the so-called SOTIF standard, and the SafeAd white paper, as well as ISO TR 4804. Those cover potential faults in sensing the environment and some edge cases. Even those standards do not cover everything because there's more to operating a fully autonomous vehicle than just being able to drive down the road. At the highest level, systems safety is covered by UL 4600, which covers safety beyond dynamic driving and also forms a framework for a safety case for the overall vehicle that makes sure no gaps have been left in stacking up the standards. UL 4600 helps make sure that everything's covered that needs to be covered to achieve system-level safety. This standard stack-up has been endorsed by the U.S. Department of Transportation, who says, quote, "This is exactly the way we wanted standards to be used." there's an associated U.S. Department of Transportation strategy document that lists these standards and says that conformance to a set of standards is the DOT strategy for ensuring safety. The introduction of highly automated vehicles will bring with it changing expectations, changing standards, and a need for a different approach to regulation. People often say, well, it needs to be at least as safe as a human driver. But it turns out what that means is quite complicated once you consider things such as local conditions and potential risk transfer from one demographic segment to another. There are expectations of the public beyond simple positive risk balance. On average isn't good enough if you're in one of the segments that suffers increased risk due to the deployment of the technology. Also expect to see increasing regulatory pressure to follow standards now that there is no longer a human driver in charge that can assume responsibility and blame for any crashes.